Sarah Martinez wiped the flour from her hands and glanced at the clock hanging above her bakery's cash register. 6:30 in the morning, and the first batch of croissants was already golden brown in the oven. The sweet smell of baking bread filled the small shop in downtown Denver, a scent that had become as familiar to her as the sound of jet engines once was. 9 years had passed since she'd last worn the blue uniform of the United States Air Force. 9 years since she'd walked away from the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon and traded her flight suit for an apron. The transition hadn't been easy, but Sarah had found peace in the simple routine of her bakery. Every morning before dawn, she'd unlock the doors, fire up the ovens, and lose herself in the meditative process of kneading dough and shaping pastries. Her customers knew her as the friendly baker who remembered their usual orders and always had a warm smile ready. Few knew about her previous life as Captain Sarah Martinez, one of the Air Force's most skilled pilots. She preferred it that way. The nightmares had finally stopped coming, and the tremor in her hands had disappeared completely about 3 years ago. Sarah had been 28 when she left the service. A promising career, her commanding officers had said. She could have made major, maybe even lieutenant colonel someday, but after what happened over the mountains of Afghanistan, flying had lost its appeal. The incident that ended her military career was classified, buried in files that would never see daylight. All she could tell people was that she'd served her country with honor and decided to pursue other interests. The truth was more complicated. During her final deployment, Sarah's squadron had been conducting a routine patrol mission when they received an emergency call. A medical evacuation helicopter had gone down in hostile territory with wounded soldiers aboard. Sarah and her wingman were the closest air support available. What should have been a simple rescue coordination turned into a nightmare. Intelligence had been wrong about enemy positions. The downed helicopter was surrounded by insurgents who had sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. Sarah's wingman, Lieutenant Jake Thompson, had been shot down while providing cover for the rescue team. She watched his plane spiral toward the mountains, helpless to do anything but call for backup that wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. Jake had been more than just her wingman. They'd been planning to get married after their deployment ended. The engagement ring was still in her jewelry box upstairs, wrapped in tissue paper she'd never had the courage to throw away. Sarah shook her head, pushing the memories back where they belonged. She'd learned to compartmentalize these thoughts, to keep them locked away while she focused on the present. The timer chimed, bringing her back to the bakery. She pulled the croissants from the oven and arranged them in the display case, their buttery layers catching the morning light. At 7 o'clock, she flipped the sign from closed to open and unlocked the front door. Her first customer was already waiting, Mrs. Rodriguez from the flower shop next door, who came in every morning for coffee and a blueberry muffin. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Mrs. Rodriguez said, counting out exact change as always. "It really is," Sarah replied, handing over the warm muffin. Through the large front windows, she could see the Rocky Mountains in the distance, their peaks dusted with early snow. Sometimes, she missed the view from 30,000 feet, the way the world looked like a perfect map spread out below. But she'd found a different kind of beauty in ground-level life. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Regular customers came and went, picking up coffee and pastries on their way to work. Sarah chatted with each of them, learning about their lives in small increments. There was Tom, the accountant who was training for his first marathon. Linda, the teacher who always bought extra cookies for her students. Mr. Peterson, the retired mailman who came in just to have someone to talk to. Around 10 o'clock, the morning rush died down, and Sarah began preparing lunch items. She'd expanded the bakery's menu over the years to include sandwiches and soups, turning it into a popular lunch spot for office workers in the area. As she sliced vegetables for the day's soup, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her brother Miguel, who still served as a master sergeant in the Air Force. They didn't talk often. He was stationed overseas, and their schedules rarely aligned. But when she saw his message, her blood ran cold. "Sarah, I need you to call me as soon as possible. It's about Jake." Her hand started shaking as she dialed Miguel's number. He answered on the first ring. "Miguel, what's going on? What about Jake?" "Sarah, I don't know how to tell you this. His voice was tight with emotion. They found him. Jake's alive. The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers and clattered to the floor. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up with trembling hands. That's impossible, she whispered. I saw his plane go down. The search and rescue team looked for days. They found wreckage. I know, but they were wrong about the wreckage. It was from an older crash, same type of aircraft. Jake has been a prisoner of war for 9 years. He was rescued yesterday during a special operations mission. Sarah leaned against the prep counter, her legs suddenly weak. Jake was alive. All these years, while she'd been mourning him, building a new life around the hole his death had left behind, he'd been somewhere in captivity. Where is he now? She managed to ask. Ramstein Air Base in Germany. He's in rough shape, Sarah. 9 years in captivity. It changes a person. But he's asking for you. He doesn't know you left the Air Force. He thinks you're still Captain Martinez. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process this information. The life she'd carefully constructed, the peace she'd found in her small bakery, suddenly felt as fragile as spun sugar. I can't, she said quietly. I'm not that person anymore, Miguel. I can't just go back. Sarah, he's been holding on to the hope of seeing you again for 9 years. It might be the only thing that kept him alive. Through the bakery's front window, Sarah watched people walking by on their way to lunch meetings and afternoon appointments. Normal people living normal lives, just like she'd been trying to do. But Jake was alive, and everything she thought she knew about the past 9 years was suddenly uncertain. I need some time to think, she told Miguel. You don't have much time. There's something else. The military is keeping this quiet for now, but word is going to get out. And Sarah, Jake's not the only one they rescued. There were 3 other American POWs in the same facility. This is going to be big news. After hanging up, Sarah stood alone in her bakery, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and the comfortable routine she'd built for herself. But all she could think about was Jake, wondering what 9 years of captivity had done to the man she'd planned to marry. Wondering if she had the strength to face the past she'd worked so hard to leave behind. The lunch crowd would be arriving soon, expecting their usual friendly baker with her warm smile and easy conversation. But Sarah Martinez felt like she was standing at a crossroads, with her carefully constructed new life on one side and the unresolved ghosts of her military past on the other. She looked at her reflection in the chrome surface of the coffee machine, a woman of 37 now, with laugh lines around her eyes and flour under her fingernails. 9 years ago, she'd been Captain Martinez, a warrior who lived by duty, honor, and courage. Today, she was just Sarah, a baker who'd found peace in the simple act of feeding people. But Jake was alive, and that changed everything. As customers began filtering in for lunch, Sarah forced herself to smile and take orders, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. How could she explain to Jake why she'd left the Air Force? How could she tell him about the nightmares, the trembling hands, the way flying had become impossible after watching his plane go down? And most importantly, how could she explain that the woman he'd been thinking about for 9 years, Captain Sarah Martinez, fearless pilot and devoted fiancée, no longer existed? The afternoon stretched ahead of her, filled with the familiar tasks of running a bakery. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was flying blind, navigating by instruments she no longer trusted, heading toward a destination she couldn't see. Sarah barely slept that night. She tossed and turned in her apartment above the bakery, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the city settling into darkness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face as it had been 9 years ago. Young, confident, with that crooked smile that had first caught her attention during flight training. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs to start the day's baking early. Working with her hands had always helped her think, and she needed clarity now, more than ever. As she mixed dough for the morning's bread, her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar international number. Sarah Martinez? The voice was professional, military. Yes? This is Colonel Patricia Hayes from Ramstein Air Base. I'm calling regarding Lieutenant Jake Thompson. He's been asking for you, and we understand you were close before his capture. Sarah's hands stilled on the dough. How is he? Physically, he's malnourished and has some untreated injuries, but nothing that won't heal with time. Mentally, well, 9 years of captivity takes its toll. He's having trouble adjusting to the idea that so much time has passed. He keeps asking when Captain Martinez is coming to see him. The colonel paused. Miss Martinez, I should tell you that we've explained you left the military, but he seems to have difficulty processing that information. His doctors think seeing you might help him accept the reality of how much time has passed. I don't know if I can help him, Sarah said honestly. I'm not the same person he knew. Perhaps not. But right now, you represent something stable from his past. He needs that anchor to start healing. After the call ended, Sarah stood in her darkened bakery, flour coating her hands and apron. She thought about the woman she'd been when she first met Jake at Shepherd Air Force Base during pilot training. She'd been fearless then, hungry to prove herself in a male-dominated field. Flying had been her passion, her identity, her future. Jake had been in the class ahead of her, already earning a reputation as a natural pilot with exceptional instincts. They'd met during a cross-training exercise, and despite military regulations about fraternization, they'd been drawn to each other. Both shared the same love of flying, the same drive to excel, the same dream of serving their country in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully. Military romances required discretion, especially when both parties were pilots, but they'd found ways to be together. Studying navigation charts over coffee, running the base perimeter at dawn, talking about their dreams during long training flights. When Jake proposed, he'd done it on the observation deck of the base's control tower, with F-16 seconds taking off in the background. I want to fly through life with you, he'd said. And she'd laughed at the cheesy line even as she said yes. Now, 9 years later, Sarah wondered if that young woman still existed somewhere inside her. The woman who'd said yes to Jake's proposal had been replaced by someone more cautious, someone who'd learned that not all missions had happy endings. The next few days passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine, but her customers noticed she seemed distracted. Mrs. Rodriguez asked if everything was all right. Tom, the accountant, commented that the usually perfect croissants were slightly overbaked. Even Mr. Peterson, usually focused on his own stories, noticed she wasn't her usual chatty self. Miguel called every day with updates. Jake was responding well to medical treatment. His debriefing was ongoing, but slowly. The military psychiatrists said he was experiencing what they called temporal displacement, difficulty accepting how much time had passed. He talked about Sarah as if she were still in the Air Force, still the same person he'd left behind. The doctors think seeing you might help him move forward, Miguel explained during one of their calls. He's stuck in the past, Sarah. Part of his healing process involves accepting that the world moved on while he was gone. And what if seeing me makes it worse? Sarah asked. What if I'm not what he needs? Then you'll deal with that together. But Sarah, you can't spend the rest of your life wondering what if. You loved him once. I loved who he was 9 years ago. I don't know who he is now. And he doesn't know who I've become. Despite her reservations, Sarah found herself researching flights to Germany. She told herself she was just looking, not committing to anything. But as she scrolled through airline websites, she realized she'd already made the decision. She owed it to Jake, and to herself, to see him. The hardest part was closing the bakery. Sarah had never taken more than a day off since she'd opened it. Her customers depended on their morning coffee and pastries, their lunch meetings over soup and sandwiches. But Mrs. Rodriguez offered to help by recommending a temporary baker, and her regular customers assured her they'd wait for her return. Everyone deserves a chance to take care of unfinished business, Mrs. Rodriguez said when Sarah finally explained she needed to travel to see someone from her past. The flight to Germany was the first time Sarah had been on an airplane since leaving the Air Force. As the plane climbed through the clouds, she was surprised to find that she wasn't afraid. The familiar sensation of flight, The way the earth fell away below brought back memories of why she'd loved flying in the first place, but it also brought back the memories she'd worked so hard to suppress. The radio chatter during that final mission, the sight of Jake's plane spinning toward the mountains, the helpless feeling of watching someone you love disappear into smoke and fire. Ramstein Air Base looked exactly like every other military installation Sarah had ever seen. Functional buildings, perfectly maintained grounds, and the constant presence of aircraft. As she passed through security, showing her credentials to stone-faced guards, she felt like she was stepping back in time. Colonel Hayes met her at the visitor center. She was a woman about Sarah's age, with graying hair and kind eyes that had probably seen too much. "Miss Martinez, thank you for coming. Before you see Jake, there are some things you should know." They sat in a sterile conference room that smelled of disinfectant and military coffee. Colonel Hayes opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. "These are from his initial medical evaluation. The physical injuries will heal, but as you can see, he's lost considerable weight. More importantly, he's struggling with the psychological adjustment. 9 years is a long time to be isolated from the world." Sarah studied the photos, searching for traces of the man she'd once known in the gaunt face staring back at her. Jake's eyes were different. Hollow. Haunted. His hair, once thick and dark, was streaked with premature gray. "How much does he remember about before?" Sarah asked. "Everything up until the day he was shot down. But he has trouble accepting that it was 9 years ago. In his mind, it was yesterday. He keeps asking when you're going to visit, when he's going back to his squadron, when the war will be over. He doesn't understand that his war ended 9 years ago. What do the doctors recommend? Patience, honesty. Don't try to pretend you're the same person you were 9 years ago. He needs to understand that time moved forward, that people changed. That includes you." Colonel Hayes led Sarah through a maze of corridors to the medical facility. With each step, Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. She'd spent 9 years learning to live without Jake, convincing herself that the woman who'd loved him was gone forever. But walking through these military hallways, breathing the familiar smell of institutional coffee and floor wax, she felt echoes of her former self stirring to life. They stopped outside a door marked with Jake's name and rank, still listed as lieutenant, the same rank he'd held 9 years ago. "Take your time," Colonel Hayes said softly. "And remember, he's not the same person either. Trauma changes people." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Through the small window, she could see a figure sitting by the window, looking out at the airfield where jets were taking off and landing in endless rotation. When she opened the door, Jake turned toward her, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Despite the physical changes, despite the years that had passed, his eyes were exactly as she remembered them, dark brown with flecks of gold, always alert, always questioning. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was exactly the same, just rougher around the edges. "I knew you'd come." He stood up slowly, as if testing his balance, and Sarah realized he was waiting for her to make the first move. She took a step forward, then another, until they were close enough to touch. "Jake," she managed to say. And then they were holding each other. And she was crying for the first time in years. He felt different in her arms, thinner, more fragile, but unmistakably him. He smelled like hospital soap and something else. Something that spoke of places she didn't want to imagine. "I knew you'd wait for me," he whispered against her hair. "I told myself every day that you'd be here when I got back." Sarah closed her eyes, holding him tight, knowing that in the next few minutes, she would have to break his heart all over again. She would have to tell him about the nightmares, the panic attacks, the way she'd walked away from flying because watching him fall had broken something inside her. She would have to explain that the woman he'd been dreaming about for 9 years had died the same day he'd been captured. But for this moment, she let herself remember what it felt like to love someone completely, without reservation, without the fear that had defined her life since his plane went down. "I'm here," she said, and meant it, even though she knew it wasn't the whole truth. Outside the window, an F-16 took off, climbing steeply into the afternoon sky, and Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 9 years. The urge to follow it into the clouds. The conversation Sarah had dreaded came 3 hours later, as they sat in the hospital's family room, sharing coffee that tasted like burnt memories. Jake had been talking non-stop about their plans, about the wedding they'd discussed, about the squadron he thought he was returning to. Reality crashed down on both of them when Sarah finally found the courage to speak. "Jake, I need to tell you something. I'm not Captain Martinez anymore. I haven't been for 9 years. He stared at her, the coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. "What do you mean? I left the Air Force 6 months after you were shot down. I couldn't fly anymore. I couldn't do anything anymore. I thought you were dead, and it broke me." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Jake set down his coffee with hands that had begun to shake. "But you waited for me," he said, his voice smaller than she'd ever heard it. "You said you'd wait. I waited for 3 years. I went to therapy. I tried to get back in the cockpit. But every time I tried to fly, all I could see was your plane going down. The doctors called it PTSD. I called it the end of everything I thought I was." Jake's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, hurt, something that might have been betrayal. "So what are you now?" "I own a bakery in Denver. I make bread and coffee for people on their way to work. I have a quiet life." "A bakery." He said it like she'd admitted to joining a circus. "You were the best pilot in our class. You lived for flying. I lived for a lot of things back then. But that woman died the day you were shot down." They sat in silence for a long time. Through the window, Sarah could see the base's flight line, where ground crews were preparing aircraft for evening training missions. The sight that had once filled her with excitement now felt like looking at artifacts from someone else's life. "I don't understand," Jake said finally. "I survived 9 years by believing you were out there. Still flying. Still being the woman I fell in love with. If you're not her anymore, then what was it all for?" It was the question Sarah had been afraid of, because she didn't have a good answer. "I don't know. I really don't know." Over the next few days, they tried to find their way back to each other. But it felt like two strangers attempting to dance to music only one of them could hear. Jake was still the man she'd loved, but he was trapped in a version of himself from 9 years ago. He talked about their future as if no time had passed, making plans for a life with a woman who no longer existed. Sarah found herself staying later each day at the base, reluctant to return to her hotel. Not because she was comfortable there, but because leaving felt like abandoning Jake all over again. She ate dinner with him in the hospital cafeteria, helped him with physical therapy exercises, and listened to carefully edited stories about his captivity. What he didn't tell her, she learned from Colonel Hayes. 9 years of isolation, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. Periods of solitary confinement that lasted months. Medical care that was minimal at best. The only thing that had kept him sane, he told his doctors, was the certainty that Sarah was waiting for him. "The guilt is eating you alive," Colonel Hayes observed during one of their private conversations. "You can't blame yourself for moving on. You thought he was dead. Well, one by this well he was dead. One by this well he was blowed. One by this well he was dead. One by this well he was dead. One by this well he was dead. One by..." But he wasn't dead. He was suffering, and I was learning to make croissants. And if you'd known he was alive, would you have been able to sustain that hope for 9 years without knowing if you'd ever see him again? Would it have been fair to ask that of yourself? Sarah didn't have an answer for that either. The breakthrough came on her 5th day at Ramstein. She was walking with Jake around the base perimeter. A route that reminded her of their morning runs during training. He'd been quiet most of the day, and she could sense him struggling with something. "I've been thinking," he said finally, stopping beside the fence that separated the base from the German countryside beyond. "Maybe I'm the one who died 9 years ago." "What do you mean?" "The man you loved was a pilot. He was confident, optimistic, ready to take on the world. That man wouldn't have given up, wouldn't have broken under pressure. He gestured toward the aircraft, taking off in the distance. I can't even look at those planes without feeling sick to my stomach. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Jake, that doesn't mean you died. It means you survived something unimaginable. Did I? Because I feel like a ghost of who I used to be. And if we're both different people now, then maybe we need to figure out who we are before we can figure out if we still make sense together. That evening, Sarah called Miguel from her hotel room. I think I need to come home soon, she told him. How is he? Broken. But maybe starting to heal. And so am I. In a weird way. What do you mean? Sarah looked out her hotel window at the German skyline, thinking about the conversation she'd had with Jake. I think I've been carrying guilt for 9 years. That doesn't belong to me. I made the best decisions I could with the information I had. We both did. And now? Now I don't know. But that's okay. We're going to figure it out. The next morning brought unexpected news. Colonel Hayes found Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, her expression grim. We have a situation, she said, sitting down across from Sarah. There's been a development with the rescue operation that brought Jake home. What kind of development? Intelligence reports indicate that the facility where he was held is planning to move their remaining prisoners. There are at least 12 more American service members in similar situations. The window for rescue is closing. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What does this have to do with Jake? The military is assembling a task force to locate and rescue these prisoners. Jake's debriefing has provided crucial intelligence about the facility's layout and security procedures. But they need more than that. Colonel Hayes paused, choosing her words carefully. They need someone who understands both the intelligence Jake provided and the tactical requirements for a rescue mission. Someone with extensive flight experience who can coordinate air support for a complex operation. You're talking about me. Your record speaks for itself, Sarah. Before your discharge, you were one of the most capable pilots the Air Force had ever trained. Your tactical knowledge, combined with Jake's intelligence, could save those 12 lives. Sarah stared at her hands, remembering the tremor that had once made it impossible for her to hold a flight stick steady. I haven't flown in 9 years. We're not asking you to fly the mission. We're asking you to help plan it. To work with our tactical team, to develop a rescue operation that has the best chance of succeeding. And if I say no, then we'll do our best without you. But Sarah, those prisoners have been waiting as long as Jake was. They deserve the same chance he got. That afternoon, Sarah found Jake in the physical therapy room, working through exercises designed to rebuild muscle mass he'd lost during captivity. When she told him about the military's request, he stopped mid-exercise. You should do it, he said immediately. Jake, I can't. I'm not that person anymore. Maybe not. But those people are where I was a week ago. If there's something you can do to help them, shouldn't you try? Sarah sat down on the therapy bench beside him. What if I can't handle it? What if being around all of this military planning brings back the nightmares? Then we'll deal with it together. But Sarah, you didn't stop being brave when you stopped flying. You stopped flying because you were scared. And that's different. They looked at each other for a long moment. Two people who had loved each other once and were trying to figure out if they could love the people they'd become. If I do this, Sarah said slowly, it doesn't mean I'm coming back to the military permanently. It doesn't mean I'm the same person I was 9 years ago. I know. But it might mean you're someone even better. The next morning, Sarah found herself in a classified briefing room, surrounded by military personnel who spoke in acronyms and studied satellite photos with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. The tactical planning sessions lasted 14 hours a day. Sarah discovered that while her hands might have forgotten the feel of a flight stick, her mind still understood the complex geometry of aerial warfare. Working with Jake's intelligence reports, she helped design an approach that would minimize risk to both the rescue team and the prisoners. She found herself thinking like a pilot again, visualizing flight paths and timing sequences, calculating risk factors and backup plans. But more importantly, she found herself working alongside Jake. His memory of the facility's layout was perfect, and his tactical insights were invaluable. For the first time since her arrival in Germany, they felt like partners again, united by a common purpose. On the third day of planning, as they worked late into the evening reviewing approach vectors, Jake looked up from his notes. "You know what I realized today?" he said. "What?" "I spent 9 years thinking about the woman you were, but I never imagined the woman you might become. And I think I like her even better." Sarah smiled, feeling something settle into place inside her chest. "Even if she bakes bread instead of flying jets?" "Especially because she bakes bread instead of flying jets. It means she chose kindness over glory. That takes a different kind of courage." Openness. The rescue mission launched 3 days later. Sarah wasn't in the cockpit, but she was in the command center, coordinating communications between air and ground units. As she watched the real-time video feeds and listened to radio chatter, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 9 years. The satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged. The mission was a success. All 12 prisoners were recovered alive, though some were in critical condition. As the rescue helicopters landed at Ramstein, Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She'd helped bring them home. Jake found her in the hallway outside the command center, still wearing her headset and tactical vest. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I remembered something important about myself. Which is? That being brave doesn't always mean being fearless. Sometimes it means being afraid and doing it anyway." They stood together in the hallway, watching medical teams rush to help the newly rescued prisoners. Sarah realized that she and Jake had both been rescued in a way. Not from physical captivity, but from the versions of themselves they'd been trapped in for 9 years. 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to Denver and reopened her bakery. But something had changed. The simple routine that had once felt like hiding now felt like choosing. She was still a baker, but she was also a woman who had helped plan a successful rescue mission. She was someone who had faced her past and found a way to honor both who she had been and who she had become. Jake stayed at Ramstein for additional medical treatment and debriefing, but they talked every day. They were figuring out how to love each other as the people they were now, rather than the people they had been. It was more complicated than their young love had been, but it was also deeper, built on a foundation of shared loss and hard-won wisdom. 6 months later, Jake came to visit Denver. He'd been medically retired from the Air Force and was considering what to do next. Sarah met him at the airport, nervous about how he would fit into the life she'd built. Her worries disappeared the moment she saw him interacting with her customers. He remembered everyone's names within a day, helped Mrs. Rodriguez carry heavy flower arrangements, and listened patiently to Mr. Peterson's stories. He understood that Sarah's bakery wasn't just a business. It was a community, a place where people felt cared for. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," he told her one evening, as they walked through downtown Denver. "And I want to work with other veterans who are transitioning back to civilian life. Help them find their way like you helped me find mine." Sarah smiled, thinking about the journey they'd both taken to get to this moment. "That sounds perfect." 1 year later, they were married in a small ceremony in Sarah's bakery, surrounded by her customers who had become their friends. Instead of fighter jets overhead, they had the smell of fresh bread and the sound of laughter. Instead of military uniforms, they wore clothes that reflected who they'd chosen to become. As they cut the cake Sarah had made herself, Jake whispered, "I love who we are now, even though we're not who we planned to be. Especially because we're not who we planned to be. We're better." Sarah looked around at the people celebrating with them. Mrs. Rodriguez taking pictures, Tom the accountant giving an unexpectedly moving speech, Mr. Peterson telling anyone who would listen about the beautiful romance he'd witnessed unfold. This wasn't the life she'd planned 9 years ago, but it was the life she'd chosen, piece by piece, decision by decision. Outside, a commercial airliner passed overhead, and Sarah watched it without the familiar stab of loss she'd felt for so many years. She'd made peace with her past as a pilot, understanding now that leaving the military hadn't been a failure. It had been the beginning of a different kind of service. 9 years after leaving the Air Force, one emergency signal had indeed sent her airborne once more. Not in the cockpit of a fighter jet, but in the mission of helping others find their way home. It had taken her back to the sky in the only way that mattered. With purpose, with courage, and with love.